The Great Fire of London in 1666 swept through the central parts of the English city. The fire, which began in a bakery, consumed a vast amount of the city, including the homes of approximately 70,000 of the city's 80,000 inhabitants. Needless to say, after the destruction caused by the fire, much of London needed to be rebuilt. But despite the mass amount of radical design proposals put forth, London was eventually reconstructed on essentially the same street plan used before the fire. In the game London, the game begins shortly after the Great Fire. Players will be given the responsibility and opportunity to build a new city on the ashes of the old. The box's cover depicts what I assume to be Robert Hooke and Christopher Wren, who've been put in charge of designing a lot of the gutted city, including the St Paul's Cathedral, which is pictured as a work in progress in the background. There is almost 250 years of London's history recreated in this game. Many of the most famous buildings and monuments are captured in detail on the illustrated cards. These elements are presented in a 2 to 4 player, hand management, card drafting, area control game that can be played within around 90 minutes. Whilst the core mechanics of this game are relatively simple, the choices offered to a player will not be. The game forces players to make tough decisions as they manage poverty, income, and of course their growing cities. So let's have a butcher's at London by me old china plate, Martin Wallace.
The goal of this game is to gain the most victory points. Victory points accumulated during the game are represented by these tokens that come in various denominations. There are a lot of ways to get victory points in London. Players may get victory points from buying land on the board, building the underground network, from having money at the end of the game, but the majority of victory points earned will be from the cards both during and at the end of the game. Players will have to keep an eye on poverty though. As they accumulate these wooden poverty points, it may see them lose some victory points. London is very much a card game. The cards are divided into 3 decks to create a sense of historical development, so as the game proceeds, players will get access to more advanced and modern structures. Most cards in the game have icons printed on them to represent their effect during play. In a player's turn, they have the choice of doing one of the following actions. They can simply draw 3 cards from the draw deck or the display area on the board. They can play cards from their hand to their building display, which is a designated place in front of a player. They can run their city, which implements some of the effects of the cards in their display, and they can buy land at the costs noted on the board. Before each of their actions, they must first draw 1 card into their hand from either the draw deck or the display area on the board. After taking one of these actions, players discard cards if necessary to meet the hand limit of 9. As a note, at any point in the game you find yourself low on cash, you can take out a loan. For each £10 loan players have at the end of the game, they must repay at a cost of £15, or they will lose victory points. So let's have a look at the play cards action first. Players performing this action play any number of cards into their building display area. Before playing a card though, players are presented with their first tough choice. They must expend a card from their hand to the board's display area, making it available to their opponents in future turns. The expended card must match the colour of the card they wish to play into their display. Choosing which cards to play and which to expend can be a very difficult choice at times. After expending a card, they then place their selected card they wish to play face up into their building display, usually side by side, but it is possible to build over an existing card, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Some cards will have an effect noted above that comes into play at this point, and some also have an additional cost in pounds that must be paid in order to place the card into your building display. The icons displayed in the lower stone area are the effects of the card that come into play when the player chooses to run their city, so I'll move on to that action now. When a player chooses to run their city, they may select some or all of their cards in their building display to activate. The stone area shows icons that tell a player the effects of the card. These icons don't take very long to become familiar with, and on the back of the rulebook there is a reference sheet. The left stone area tells a player if they must expend a card to the board to activate it, or perhaps they may have to pay money to activate it. The centre area is the reward, what players will gain from activating the card. It will most likely be money, victory points, the ability to discard a quantity of poverty points, or maybe a combination of these benefits. The right stone area displays whether or not to flip the card once it has been activated. Most cards will require this to occur, in which case the card is flipped over and is no longer available to the player in preceding turns. As a result of a player running their city, they then accumulate poverty points. Poverty points, as you can imagine, are not something you want, as they can see you lose victory points. The amount of poverty points a player receives is dependent on the number of cards in their hand at the time they activate their city, and it is also dependent on the number of individual stacks of cards in the player's building display. So this is why you might want to build over cards in your display, to limit the number of stacks. As a side note, you can build over face-up or face-down cards in your display. So managing your building display size and your hand size is crucial to managing poverty points. The only way to offset the amount of poverty points received is by having purchased land. Having land helps you reduce the number of poverty points taken during this action. To buy land, you simply place one of your coloured building tokens in a borough of land of your choosing. A limitation is that it has to be adjacent to another building, but not necessarily one of your own. You pay the price on the board, draw the number of cards listed in the borough, and at the end of the game, you will receive the amount of victory points noted here for having purchased that land. Only one player may have a building token in a borough. So that's a basic overview of the mechanics. The game's rules are quite simple, and I'll add in now that the rulebook is both clear and laid out in a way that is very easy to follow. Upon looking at that overview, you may think that London doesn't have a whole lot to offer. A lot of the choices in the game have to do with the cards themselves. You might find yourself buying land in particular locations because of the cards, or only playing down certain colours into your display. Some cards also make it easier to avoid poverty. We'll have a look at a few of the more unique cards. These here are the shops, and these bring in income each time you play a card into your display. Remember, you choose when to activate it though, and when you choose to activate this card, which will probably be several rounds later as the money accumulates, you gain the money on that card. However, leaving a card in your display like this generally adds to the amount of stacks, which adds to the amount of poverty points accumulated from running your city. So depending upon your strategy, this might not be worthwhile. There are also pauper cards, and these cards are a problem. They cannot be expended to play down a card or be played themselves. They essentially hog your hand and are relatively useless. One way of getting rid of them is to purposely exceed the hand limit so you can discard them, but that will probably come at a disadvantage if you wish to run your city. Another way is to educate them using a school. This allows you to expend a card of any colour, but pay £1 to do so you can get rid of paupers by using the school. Having a card like this may be good, but again it adds to your display, perhaps adding to the amount of poverty points earned. So having a school or a workhouse can be really useful.
London is a game that I'm really enjoying at the moment, and for many reasons, one of which is the theme. The location, time period, and in particular London's architecture is something that I've always found fascinating. So to see all the buildings and the streets of London presented in great artwork on the cards, well, I mean, the game's off to a good start right there. But the choices you make in this game are what has me coming back for more. In the designer notes on the back page of the rulebook, Martin Wallace writes, "The development of London is an interesting example of how to reduce the number of mechanisms in a game without it losing the overall feel." And that's what I first noticed about the game. The rules themselves are quite simple, but this is a pretty deep game with strategies and tactical decisions that I feel are worth exploring, worth coming back to. I really enjoy working on and improving my approach to this game. I've heard that there is a somewhat powerful strategy out there. It has been discussed in the Board Game Geek forums. If you feel the need to check that out, you can go there by all means. I generally stay away from the strategy forums for some time after getting a game. I like to work on the strategies myself. I get a lot of enjoyment out of that. Now, the gameplay in London leans more toward a multiplayer solitaire experience, and probably more so than some might like. There is the odd card in the deck that allows you to directly interact with your opponents, but there isn't many of them, and none of them are, really damaging to your opponent if played. Now, I don't mind multiplayer solitaires on occasion, and given the theme of this game, I think it makes sense to have the game geared that way. What I don't like in games is if they don't create tension, and tension in games can often be created solely from your opponent's decisions against your own and that headbutting that can occur. Buying land in London can see players become a bit competitive at times, particularly in a game with 3+ players, but the tension here comes mostly from your own decisions as you're forced to manage income and your outgoing expenses. You might have to activate your city in a particular order to get the income from one card to activate another, or you might not have enough money in the first place, in which case you might have to consider taking out a loan. Money in the game can be pretty tight at times, so there's a pressure to maintain a steady flow of income, even if it's only a small amount. Poverty also feels like a constant battle. You'll have to activate your city to get ahead, of course. You're going to get some income from that, maybe some victory points, and then you're going to get handed those poverty points. And you're going to have to work at offloading those, and you'll often have to make it a priority. Poverty points can really set you back at the end of the game, so you really want to keep an eye on them. So there's tension in the game. It's mainly created by, sometimes not being able to do exactly what you want when you want, because something like reducing poverty or gaining income takes priority. Now, the game's rules make London relatively easy to introduce players to, But note, it can really punish a player if they make a mistake early on. So one thing worth explaining is the ramifications from running a city with a lot of stacks or running a city with a handful of cards early on. If you have a lot of poverty early, which you most likely will if you do those things, it will be very hard to offload them. Growing your cities is a good option, and sort of, expanding the stacks in your display as the game progresses. The downsides of the game, well, for me personally, I'm going to look at sleeving the cards. They're not terrible quality or anything, but they are handled a lot, and they're not plastic coated. The playtime as well, which is 90 minutes, I never felt our games dragging or anything. Players' turns seemed to be reasonably quick, I thought. It would just be a lot easier for me to get this one to the table if it was, if it played in around 60 minutes. That might not be an issue for some, and maybe with more plays with the same group, we might be able to get it down closer to 60 minutes. Thanks for watching another episode of Castelli Reviews, and I hope to see you all again soon.